John is going to read an excerpt from his novel, A Moment in the Sun, which, for those of you who have not read it or not seen it, it's about 1,000 pages long, and it's an incredible epic about turn-of-the-century America, 1898 to 1902, which also includes Cuba, Cuba, the Philippines, Hong Kong, North Carolina, Alaska, Hawaii. It's an epic about the making of an imperial America and its effect upon very specific neighbors, fortunate and unfortunate peoples. So we'll start off with that, and then after that we'll have a conversation between the three of us about the making of your films and your careers as artists, filmmakers, and in Vilsoni's case, playwright too, and the relationship of all of that to the Pacific.
Okay, this is from a chapter that concerns one of the main characters in A Moment in the Sun, Diosdado Concepcion, who's an educated kid who's been studying in Manila, and without any military training finds himself a lieutenant leading a squadron of Filipino warriors from different parts of Luzon who don't necessarily even speak the same languages. And it's set right at the same time that this is, when the Filipinos were in a guerrilla war retreat going north. A runner trots in from the west, looking exhausted. He sees Diosdado's uniform, approaches and salutes. "Mi teniente," he gasps, catching his breath. "You have a man here who speaks Americano?" "I am that man." "They need you right away." He points back the way he came. "Just down the road, una media lega, at the great tree." Diosdados nods. "Stay and eat something before you go back." "Gracias, jefe." He leaves Sargento Bayani in charge and heads down the road to the west, refugees from Marilao eyeing him uneasily as they pass on their way to Bulacan. Herrera, who is the head of intelligence under General Del Pilar, stands with a squad of bored-looking fusileros guarding an American prisoner under a huge kupang tree. The soldier is very young and very blonde and very sunburned, looking scared and defiant at the same time as he sits with his hands bound behind his back. He doesn't seem to be wounded. "Bring him out here." Herrera's men pull the boy to his feet and drag him out into the midday sun to face Diosdado. "You know what we want?" asks Herrera. Diosdado nods and walks around the soldier, who tries to keep a steady gaze but has to blink as the sweat rolls into his eyes. "Your name?" "Winston Wall." "What regiment are you in, Winston Wall?" The boy squints, frowns. "I don't have to tell you nothing." Diosdado examines Wall's uniform. They have good boots, all of them, and go into battle with belts spiked full of ammunition. "You are a private in the Kansas Volunteers," he says, "under Colonel Funston." Wall tries to hawk on the ground, but can't make enough spit. "Maybe I am, maybe I'm not." Diosdado speaks to Herrera in Tagalog. Some of the Yankees understand Spanish. "How was he captured?" Herrera smiles. "This Yankee cannot swim. We pulled him out downstream from the fight at Marilao." Diosdado turns back to the private. "The Kansas soldiers have already made a reputation." "It seems that your compadres have abandoned you." "I just got separated, that's all." The boy, taller by a head than Diosdado, lifts his chin and tries to look indifferent. "So you people gonna shoot me?" Diosdado shakes his head but doesn't smile. "Not now. Not here." "You gonna feed me then? I haven't ate for 2 days." Diosdado nods at the fusileros, tiny looking near the American, who follow their words with rapt incomprehension. Most have never seen a Yankee who wasn't charging at them with a Springfield in hand. "When these men get to eat," he says to the private, "I'm sure they'll give you something." "Did you fight at Caloocan?" The boy can't help but grin. That was one hell of a scrap. You boys give it to us pretty hot for a spell till they brung down the artillery on you and tore the hell out of that town. Then it was pretty much butt and bayonet drill." "You executed prisoners." The boy seems perplexed, frowning again. "I don't know how we held on to anybody long enough for them to be a prisoner," he says finally. "Isn't there some kind of rule about that?" "If a man is unarmed and surrendered, He is a prisoner. Such actions have their consequence. So you are going to shoot me? Diosdado looks up into the boy's sunburnt face. His nose has begun to peel. That depends on what you can tell us. The boy looks as if he will cry. But I don't know nothing. I don't even know where this is. We are on a road between Marilao and Bulacan. I mean where this whole island is, like on a map. I've never been out of Kansas till they shipped us out west, and I was sick on the boat the whole damn trip over. Come to that Hong Kong, they wouldn't even let me ashore. There isn't much to know. The Americans are driving north and east from Manila, and they had better rifles and better training, and officers who speak the same language as their men, officers who aren't constantly threatening to murder each other. You had better think of something, he says to Private Wall. The people where they are taking you are very angry. Now, I can tell you one thing. The boy is shifting from one foot to the other and sweating heavily now. The Yankees have been in the country long enough to have the dysentery, and if they stay through the humid months, many will die. The Spanish cemetery in Manila is already full of muchachos who wasted away with disease and weren't worth the trouble to ship their bodies back home. I can tell you one damn thing, he continues, and that's that you goo-goos don't hold a prayer in this deal. Once Uncle sets his cap for something, you can't chase him off from it. We got an army full of Indian fighters and wild-ass country boys, and there ain't a thing we like better than an old-fashioned rabbit hunt. He jerks his head at Diosdado. You're as near to a white man as they got here. You ought to tell them they don't have a show. Herrera, curious at the boy's outburst, steps closer. What is he saying? Diosdado wonders how he would act if captured by the Americans. What posture of resolute defiance befits an officer of the Philippine Republic? He tells me that we're losing the war. The Capitan smiles grimly. I'll pass that on to my superiors. Diosdado gives Private Wall a last appraising look, then starts back to the village of Bulacan. Your prisoner is about to shit his pants, he calls, and then you're going to have to smell him all the way to headquarters. The first line of trenches in Bulacan is dug at the south end of the village, women and boys running with water held in joints of bamboo for their own men and for the soldiers who toil beside them. The Pampangano brothers have something resembling a tinola cooking, and many of the men are chewing on unripe mangoes they have knocked down. It is the time of day when Diosdado feels like he would resign his commission and surrender to the enemy in exchange for a café con leche and a buñuelo at La Campana on the corner of Escolta and San Jacinto. He had not appreciated the sweetness of his student days, the dreamlike quality of life in the walled city, and now it is gone forever. What was he like? Asked Sargento Biani, helping the men reinforce the trench walls with links of bamboo and palm trunks. The prisoner. Big, says Diosdado, like all of them, giants. This I have seen. Diosdado sits on top of the piled earth. His uniform pants can't get any filthier. Above all else, the Americanos are not the Spanish. In what way? The Spanish are capable of wickedness, and they're weary 300 years of fighting us here. And the Americanos? The Americanos are innocent in the way a crocodile is innocent. He has seen them shoot unarmed men, men begging to live, has seen them set fire to a palm thatch hut to drive whoever is inside out onto their bayonets. But still they seem guileless, childlike in their murder. Innocent and hungry, he says. Bayani spits. I grew up hungry. I mean hungry for everything. Hungry for our lands, our souls, hungry for the world. These people, he waves to the south, to where he knows the Americans are marching, steadily moving forward. They could devour every one of our islands and still not be satisfied. The Capitan Municipal of Bulacan shuffles up to Diosdado then, bowing twice as he approaches, and holds something out to him. It is a flintlock pistol from the time of the Peninsular War and smells like the cigar box it has been kept in. My grandfather owned this, he says. He fought against the Spanish. All alone? Whenever they turn their backs, I offer it to the cause. Do you have bullets for it, hermano? Asks Bayani. The man scratches his head. My grandfather kept them hidden in a different place so we wouldn't be tempted to shoot each other. But he is dead now. After the battle has passed and you've come back, says Diosdado, gently pushing the pistol back into the Capitan's hands, send the children out into the field to pick up the shell casings. We have a factoría in San Fernando where they are filled and become bullets again. Por supuesto, mi teniente. And when you talk to the Yankee officer who comes here to burn your village, tell him that you were forced to help us dig, that there were hundreds and hundreds of us, and that you were afraid. If you wish, sir. And when those boys who helped us raise the Filipino flag are a bit older, my sons, you mean? When your sons are a bit older, send them to join with us. The Capitan Municipal is clearly troubled by the idea that the war may last so long. But where will you be? With the Igorots, smiles Bayani, with the naked Igorots, the dog-eaters in the Cordillera, sharpening our spears with the true Filipinos.
We'll have time for questions from the audience as well after our conversation. For those of you who did not see Vilsoni Hereniko's film, The Land Has Eyes, it's an intimate family drama about life on Rotuma, which is an island that's a part of Fiji, which, safe to say, most people probably know very little about. But it's also a place that was subjected to British colonization. And John's film is about American colonization in the Philippines. And the third film we're going to show tonight is called Sunny. It's a big-budget Korean romantic melodrama / epic about the Vietnam War, about the Korean soldiers who fought on the side of the United States, and very specifically about a Korean woman who decides that the only way that she can save her husband, who has volunteered to go fight in the Vietnam War, is to join a Korean pop band that's going to go to Vietnam and entertain the troops. So that's what she does. She volunteers and she travels across the ocean to Vietnam. So the reason that we had selected these three films is that we had wanted to talk about sort of the varied experiences of colonization and warfare across the Pacific, but very specifically about histories that are not well known to people in the United States. The Philippine-American War has often been called the Forgotten War. Histories of British colonization in Fiji are practically unknown here in the United States. And the role that Korea played in the Vietnam War has been totally forgotten, even though Korea was the US's biggest ally during that time. So my first question is, as filmmakers, as writers, John's a novelist also, and Vilsoni's a playwright, what are the challenges of trying to make movies about histories that your audiences, for the most part, probably will not know anything about? What are the kind of the challenges that you were thinking of as you picked your subject and as you were making these films?
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah, for me, coming from a very small minority group, the challenges I would say are enormous. But a lot of these challenges, I suspect, are the same for any filmmaker. Anywhere. But for me particularly, for a start, it's the fact that the way people act and behave and think about the world, and for example, the influence of the ancestors who are supposedly dead but are still very influential in people's lives. The supernatural world, so to speak, is so dominant in people's lives that to communicate that unseen world to a global audience in which that world is more or less very dim or dead or very distant, it's a barrier that I find myself trying to breach, perhaps not very successfully. Those of you who saw The Land Has Eyes would know what I'm talking about. The final scene, for example, with the spirit world being the final arbiter of justice, is something that I think would be very foreign to many mainstream audience members. But that's just typical of the many challenges. For a start, the language barrier and the loss of cultural specificity as you try to meet the needs of a mass audience. For example, the beginning of The Land Has Eyes, the father starts telling the founding myth of the island by saying Hanuch, and then the family members say Ma. Hanuch actually is an invocation to the spirit world to enter the father's heart and mind and soul, so he would deliver words that would have power, would have mana, would have efficacy. Now, to translate that to English, I thought and thought about how to do that, so I ended up with Once Upon a Time, which to me is so reductive, and I'm so aware of how much that I've lost in that translation. And that goes right throughout the films. There are one or two very powerful ancient proverbs. One that says, "Hio raitam hio lafa," which means when you're up on the tree and you're trying to break that branch that is full of fruit, whether it's oranges or mangoes, make sure you break it. Because if you don't, well, you're stuck up there, and the people down there aren't going to benefit either. So all that is for naught. Now, how do I translate that to an audience? I thought and thought, so it ended up becoming, you must complete what you set out to do. That's what the father tells the girl, and that's how I translated it. But for Rutumans, when I was growing up, for example, that proverb was what made me persevere and what made me determined to succeed. And I know it was so powerful and meaningful to me, but when I translated to you must complete what you set out to do, it hardly touches any part of my body at all in English. But fortunately for me, I have the language to fall back on and to have that resonance that I know is missing. I'll pass on to John, but that's just one of the many challenges that I find myself facing.
Yeah, I think for me doing, and I've done a lot of things, let's say outside my own culture or outside my own subculture. For me, in making a story of it, some of what you can do is, for the audience's sake, is lean on the audience's own experience, not with the world that they're seeing in the movie, but with movies themselves. And that's why very often some of the most successful movies that bring us into another world are generic movies. So people can at least say, oh, this is like a Western, or this is a horror movie, or there's elements of horror movie, kind of magical realism in your movie. And that is comforting in a way, but also just that people recognize recognizable human behavior. So a lot of what I tried to do with Amigo is start with a very, very human story. And I've often said that this is a movie that the character that Joel Torre plays, the mayor, could have been set in France during the Nazi occupation, in Algeria during the French occupation, in Vietnam during the French, Japanese, or American occupation, of that small village mayor who wakes up every morning wondering, how much can I cooperate without collaborating and betraying my people and myself, and how much can I resist without getting killed and getting my people killed? That's a very human, there's a line in Amigo where the colonel says, we're trying to win these people's hearts and minds. Most of us associate that with the Vietnam War. Teddy Roosevelt said that in 1900, and it's from the Bible. So there was some Roman officer in Judea when they were having trouble with the Israelites or whatever, who was saying, well, we have to win their hearts and minds first. And then the next thing he said, the hell with their hearts and minds. Let's just kill a bunch of them and maybe they'll behave. So you take those basic human things, and then you do your kind of historical and emotional research and try to get into the minds. So it's an unusual war movie in that you spend time with both sides. In fact, you spend time with three sides because you spend time with the people caught in between, the villagers instead, and try to get into what do they know. And a lot of what I try to do is the audience has an advantage that none of the characters do, which is they can read the subtitles. They see scenes that the opposition never sees. So all of these people are acting in ignorance, not stupidity, but ignorance. They don't know enough about the other people probably to know they shouldn't even be fighting each other. So the basic, tenet of the Philippine-American War was in the first couple years, because it was volunteer soldiers, most of those soldiers had, out of the goodness of their hearts, some of them wanted to be warriors, but seeing pictures in a newspaper of Cubans who were held in concentration camps, and that was the Spanish word for them, who looked like people from Auschwitz in our memory. And they said, that can't happen in our hemisphere. I'm going to join this fight against the Spanish. I'm going to free the Cuban people from those awful Spaniards. They waited a week or two too long, and their unit happened to get shipped to Filipino. And after a one-day fake war with the Spanish, all of a sudden they were told, oh, you know who our enemy actually is here? Those Filipinos. And some of them bought it. Some of them liked it. Some of them did it despite the fact they liked it. And some of them said, what the hell am I doing here, taking liberty away from the people I was supposed to free?
You mentioned the figure of the mayor in your film as a common trope, the collaborator who is in a really difficult situation. But another figure was the translator, the father, the padre in the film. And there's also a translator in Vilsoni's film.
Both of them false translators.
Both, and that's exactly right. They're both false translators. They are really prototypical figures in colonialism. Can you trust a translator, or is a translator going to betray you?
They're going to have an agenda.
Colonialism, right?
Yeah.
So, and so I want you to talk about that. But also, it seems to me that both of you are also occupying positions as translators too, because you're telling stories to audiences that will most likely be, well, at least in the United States, will be uninformed about the stories and the histories themselves. And so inevitably, audiences will look at the two of you as with hope that you would do a faithful job translating, following through on the claims that you're making about these representations that you're putting forth. So yeah, maybe talk a bit about the figures of the translators in the films, but then also yourselves as possible translators too.
Yes, in the Land Has Eyes, the translator, of course, mistranslated. That is actually based on a real life incident in my own family. My father was charged with stealing coconuts, and a translator said exactly the same words. And so over the years, that was passed down as part of my family's history. And the shame that came with that. One of the reasons I made this movie is to redeem my father's name. But part of the reason they mistranslate is because in such a small community, people are so interconnected, and land, in the case of Rotuma, is not owned individually, it's owned communally. And copra being the only means of making any money, it was easy for people to, to steal each other's coconuts, which seems like such a silly thing to be in court about. You can imagine that poor, white officer who has to be sitting there all day trying to deliberate who steals whose coconuts, right? But basically, it's a situation that lends itself to forging alliances with those in power, which tends to be what happens in that case, and so that incident is based, on a real life event that happened to my family. For me, as someone who, as you say, is trying to translate my culture to film or to plays or into stories that I write, I'm aware of an enormous responsibility as an artist to portray my people, the Rotuman people, with complexity, as fully human, right? With, there's some of us that are wonderful and some that are evil and some that are, sort of caught in between. Before I made The Land Has Eyes, I thought that my own people were just absolutely wonderful until I went to make it there, and all the obstacles that stood in the way of my making the film, and I should acknowledge my wife's contribution, Jeanette here, Paulson, because I would not have made that film without she believing in me. Can we ask Jeanette to please stand up? There she is. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Jeanette found all the money, but the thing is, I never went to film school, and so but I've always been interested in storytelling right from an early age. My father is the father in the story, telling the family the myths and legends of the island. So with Jeanette's empowerment of me and the fact that she believed that I could venture into filmmaking, that was why we ended up making that. But in making that, I was fully aware that I had to represent my people as accurately as I could. And of course, whatever you put out there is always a partial truth, because you can never accurately and completely portray the complexity of a whole culture, of a whole people. But knowing that that is the ideal that you aim for, and also the fact that I have been teaching a course on representations of Pacific Islanders in film, I'm very aware that I needed to deliver a better representation, a more accurate representation than perhaps most other filmmakers who have not had time to reflect and to analyze and to critique the way Native people have been portrayed over the years. If I can just mention a screening that we had in Moscow, in Russia, and watching, the Russians sort of seeing the movie and having someone translate it, simultaneously. And the room was, it was, you could hear a pin drop. No one made any noise. It was all very silent and quiet. I wondered if they were seeing the same movie, that I was seeing. I was actually quite worried. I thought, wow, here I am amongst people, and one of the questions someone asked was, are the colors really like that? They just seem too green or too blue, or, I was so aware of the huge chasm between my culture and Russian culture, and the fact that for these people, that was the only representation they would ever get about my culture, and what a huge responsibility for me to do as best a job I could in those circumstances. So yes, as a translator, you try your best not to mistranslate, but sometimes, because it's not just you doing your job, other people will have to bring their own reading of whatever you're doing, and sometimes I think there's a disconnect there, and there's not much you can do about it.
Yeah, translation's a really interesting thing. The first short story that I ever had translated into another language was a story called The Anarchist Convention, and it's in first person, and it's narrated by a woman in basically very thick New York Jewish left-wing dialect, and it was translated into Japanese. And I have no idea if they did a good job, but I know they didn't get the rhythm. It's impossible to get that rhythm except in that rhythm. So I know one major, it's almost like you took the music soundtrack off of a movie and you're watching the movie. What I also know, however, is I'm a huge fan of Akira Kurosawa's movies. And watch most of them more than once and feel like I know them very well. But then I've sat with somebody Japanese and talked about those movies, and they'll say, and wasn't it wonderful that the kimono that the guy was wearing, the yukata the guy was wearing, had this design on it, and of course that means that he's a Buddhist. And I realize I'm getting maybe 70% of the movie. And that somebody Japanese who understands that Ronin period or whatever is going to get closer to 100%. So what you hope is that there's enough there, and that's why I was talking about that basic human thing, which is the Russian audience wanted to know what happened next to that little girl, and they got caught up in her story. And so of course there's things that they don't get, and there's things that the people on the island are going to get, and they're going to think are funny or inaccurate or totally accurate or whatever, that nobody else is even going to notice. But there's still that basic human thing. And I think it's one of the reasons that we tell stories. And very often in my movies, and this is one of the things that is why I'm still an independent filmmaker, meaning somebody who can't get money to make movies. That's how you translate that phrase, is that I've made a bunch of movies where there are subtitles. Because there's not another way, if somebody is just speaking English with a thick accent, to believe that the other person really doesn't understand what they're saying. And that, I'm interested in the things that separate us as human beings and that we allow to separate us from human beings, and language is one of them. And then a translator, and they may even be trying their hardest, But it's like your translator, he doesn't speak the native language very well. He's been gone too long. And the chiefs are laughing at him at the end of, what's he talking about? Where did he learn how to speak our language? It happens all the time, is somebody may mistranslate, not because they have an agenda, but just because they claim to speak the language better than they actually do.
I have many more questions, but let's see if there's any questions from the audience. Just shout out your questions.
Like about 6 years ago, I watched Make One, and that was one of the early films that I watched that kind of inspired me to be a filmmaker. And now that you released Amigo, and I'm thinking it's like, well, what advice would you give someone who wants to make a film about like colonial mentality among Filipinos?
You know, my main practical advice is to do something like I did here, which is, you know, I studied for my novel the history of the entire, you know, Philippine-American War, but when I went to make a movie there, I set it on a village level because I could afford this is a 3-horse army movie. You know, it's a war movie with a limited number of people in it. But I felt like there's a good story that stands for something bigger and stands for the bigger conflict, so that you're not spending all your time and money on the scale of the thing, but on the human importance in the story that you want to tell. So when you're thinking about it, you kind of condense your feelings about that mentality, and then you say, okay, what's a good arena to tell that story in? Can it be a single family? Can it, you know, like, you know, this movie is really, you see a neighborhood. You don't see the whole island. You see, and at the end the girl says, well, most of us are related to each other. You know, you really see only about, you know, 3 or 4 families interacting, and that's one of the reasons that everything is so heavy, because these people can't move away from each other. So I think a lot of it is to say, let's bite off something that I can chew. Let's make, you know, my first movie cost $40,000. I had that budget, and I said, what can I do well for $40,000? You know, rather than what's the most ambitious thing that I can think of, and how am I ever going to raise that much money?
Over there.
In Amigo, I think I counted maybe 5 languages being spoken. So continuing with the theme of translation, as a writer, as a director, what are the challenges of directing in so many languages?
Well, I do speak Spanish, so that wasn't a problem. I do speak English. What's an interesting thing, I had made a movie called Men with Guns, Hombres Armados, in Mexico, set in a, you know, imaginary Latin American country. And a lot of my actors were not speaking either Spanish or English. They were speaking indigenous languages that I don't understand. And one of the things that I learned from that was that there was actually an interesting advantage in directing when, although I knew what the scene was about because I had written it, and I had, for instance, asked the actors to translate it into Tzotzil or Chol or whatever language was being spoken, I could forget about the musical note that I thought they should hit on a certain word that directors fight to not have in their head, but it's hard not to, and really look at that performance in terms of emotion and focus. So when I auditioned the Filipino actors for this, I auditioned them in Tagalog. We had a very good local guy who did a translation, and the actors would come in and say, oh, this is really deep Tagalog. This is like my grandfather spoke, you know, because I asked him to write it in, not only in Tagalog, but period Tagalog, appropriate to the character's educational level and personality and stuff like that. And they would do their parts. One of the women there, the woman whose daughter is killed and kind of goes crazy, she doesn't have hardly any lines, and so I wrote in English half-page little monologue about a woman who goes to the hospital and she thinks her daughter is just, you know, has the flu or something, and then is told that her daughter died. And I said, go out, I'm going to give you half an hour, translate this into Tagalog and come back and do it for me. And she came back and made me cry in a language I don't speak. And I said, she's hired. So some of what it is that there's a quality of truth and emotion that an actor can have that has nothing to do with the words they're saying. And so a lot of what I did in this case is I just, as I was cutting it, I cut it without having it translated first. And then my assistant editor, Mario Antal, and Tagalog's his second language, but at least he speaks it. He listened very carefully, and every once in a while he said, I think you've got, you know, one word on the end of this cut and the same word in the beginning of the other, and so we have to slide things around a little bit. But I had the emotion of the scene and the rhythm of the scene the way that I wanted it to. And then the other thing that you have to deal with is that what do people do when they're talking to each other and they don't speak each other's language? You know, how does that affect them? And the nice thing is that most of my American actors who their characters had to deal with the Tagalog-speaking people, they read the script once, and then they forgot what the other guy said in English, and they used the two-language script. So they were really talking. They really didn't understand what the person they were speaking with was saying, but they had to watch them for, what do I think he's saying? What are those physical things that he's giving me? So there's a different kind of attention, unless they're the character who just says, whack, 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 whack. I don't want to even listen to what this person's saying. I can't understand it. Why doesn't he speak English? Was he stupid? And that's another, you know, character appropriate, you know, reaction.
Other questions? Yes, in the front.
Hi, I'd like to ask a simple question. Three of you maybe you could give us a reasonable answer. The movie mentioned you have to win the hearts and minds of the people, and the other movies you have to work hard for the success, you know. But anyway, my question is, it happened Korean War, Vietnam War, Iraq, and then Afghanistan. It's two sides doing a battle, and during the night time, one side moves out and the other side comes in. They said, we are so hungry, we'll cook for some food and we'll hide some weapons on the barn, so don't tell anybody. So during the daytime they move out and the other side comes in, and then they say, oh, you fed the enemy, you had a shelter, and then did you hide any weapon? Did they hide any weapon? So what choice do they have? If they say no, if they find the weapon, they will be killed, you know. You say, show the weapon, then the other side comes in and nine back, then, oh, you told them where the weapon is, so they kill them more. So what choice do the people have in between those combat?
Well, it's one of the reasons this movie I mentioned before is called Men with Guns, and it doesn't say one side or the other, and it's truly about the people who are caught in between. And if you live in one of those villages, you're pretty far from the political center of thought in your country. And when men with guns show up, and it doesn't matter what uniform they're wearing or whether they're occupiers or from your country, it's bad. It's trouble. And so all I think is, I feel bad for those people. You know, most of the people who are victims in war are not combatants. Whether they die from being caught in the crossfire or from starvation because the fields haven't been tilled, or from disease after wars, which is the history of the world, you know, their bad luck is to be caught in between some awful civil war or war between countries, or, you know, crusades or something like that. So what you try to do is people try to survive however they can to protect their own families. If they can, and they have, you know, the resources or the courage or whatever, they try to protect some other people. And that's about, they do the best they can, is the only answer. But what I think is important, what I try to do in this is, it's very hard to judge people who are in that situation. You read, you know, Filipino historians are all now, you know, struggling with this thing as, who are our heroes? Who was a sellout? At what point, you know, Aguinaldo, when he surrendered, who was the big general and the president of the Philippine Republic, he said, okay, they caught me, everybody give up. Well, there were Filipino generals all over the islands who said, well, they didn't catch me, we're fighting for another 2 months. There was one Filipino general, Ricarte, who never gave up, went into exile, was jailed by the Americans, went and ran a restaurant in Japan and came back with the Japanese and ended up working for them, killing Filipino guerrillas who were fighting against the Japanese. And as far as he was concerned, he was the only person who wasn't a sellout, even though most Filipinos said, this guy is a madman. It's so hard to judge, you know, and that's mostly what I think when I look at those situations is, I don't know what I would do if I was caught in that situation. As I said, the guy wakes up every morning and he says, well, what can I get away with? What do I have to do? What's the best thing for my people? And there's no honorable or right way out of it. You just play it by ear the best you can. And in this movie, there really wasn't a way out for him because he had that position. And it's, you know, one of the things that inspired me to do this movie is I ran across the statistic that hundreds, if not thousands, of these capitanes de barangay, these village mayors, were killed by one side or the other during the Philippine-American War because you couldn't please both sides.
That was certainly true for Vietnam too, I think, and for all these kinds of conflicts. So do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, could I, if I could just use an analogous situation. Many of you probably know that Fiji at the moment is a dictatorship. We have had 4 military coups since the British gave Fiji independence in 1970. And a large part of the reasons, particularly for the first 3 coups, was because there are 2 major races, the Fijians and the Indians, about 50-50. So racial tensions and conflict was one of the reasons why the country was kind of falling apart. The Rutumans, my people, are caught in the middle of this struggle for power between the Fijians and the Indians. So we have often, as an ethnic group, tried to stay neutral in the middle, but we find ourselves being pulled in different directions. The Chief Justice, for example, in the most recent coup, came from my island, a Rutuman, and he ended up being a casualty of this struggle, and he lost his job and he's fled to another island. That's just as an example. But also for the Rutuman people, we are sometimes seen as indigenous to Fiji, right? Because we have our own language and our own culture, and we had been kind of forced in a way to be part of Fiji, but we see ourselves as very different. And that sometimes works to our disadvantage. For example, at the moment, the government rules by decrees, right? So you wake up one morning and all of a sudden, everyone in Fiji who's a citizen is supposed to be called Fijian, right? And a large part of the reason is because that would work to the advantage of the Indians, all right, to be called Fijians, because they would feel, you know, more connected to the land, having lived there for more than 100 years, many of them. However, for the Rutuman people, my own people, we don't want to be called Fijians because we are Rutumans. And to be called Fijians by decree would mean a loss of our own identity. But anyway, that's just an example of how being caught in the middle is a no-win situation quite often.
Now, Vilsoni, John's made 18 movies. He makes it look very easy. Yeah. I'm sure it's not, but he makes it look easy.
I know.
This is your first film. How hard was it to make this movie?
Maybe if I can just touch him through osmosis, it will come to me. Well, you know, as I said, I never went to film school. So I think it was because my wife and I had just gotten married and we were madly in love. And both of us are storytellers that, I don't know, looking back, if I knew how difficult it was then, I never would have done it because I was just horrified at the huge leap of faith that we took. And I can only say that the film was completed because we had the backing of the ancestors, of the spirit world, because of the number of things that happened that to me are unexplainable. But through a series of events and coincidences, we were able to complete the film. For example, by the time we'd finished shooting it, we'd run out of money. And so the film was in the can for about 2 years. There didn't seem to be any way we could finish it. And then some Maori woman heard about it and came through, excuse me, and offered us you know, her editing suite in Coromandel in New Zealand, flew me over there for 3 years. got an editor, the third editor, to cut the film. And somehow we managed to pull it all together. And there are so many instances along the way that indicated to me that I was destined to make this film for the Rutuman people. And so there were angels along the way who came and rescued the situation. If I can give you one quick example of the first sign that came to me that I was supposed to make the movie. I pitched it to a Rotary Club in Fiji. There was no money in the bank. Told the story, and there were about 11 men and one woman, businesswoman. And at the end of that, an Indian man said to me, "Come to my office on Friday, and we'll talk about your film." So I went there, and he said, "You know, I know you don't know me, but when I heard you tell your story about growing up and how you wanted to make a feature film, drawing from those experiences, and how when the rain fell, you know, the roof leaked and you had to put a saucepan out there, I said to myself, that is my story. And now I'm an architect, but those are the humble beginnings I came from. And I really want you to tell that story." And then he reached under the table, took out a brown paper bag, and put it on the table and said, "Now take this, open an account, and put it in the bank." And I said, "What's in there?" He said, $5,000 notes. I don't know what an architect is doing. Maybe it was drug money. I don't know. I said, $5,000? He said, "Yes, I'm sorry, that's all I can afford." And I just burst into tears, right? And I burst into tears because for a total stranger to believe in me, someone who's never made a movie before, right, that I could pull this off. I was just, you know, my first thought was, why would anyone believe in me, right? But anyway, so I said to him, "Oh, what do you expect out of this 5,000? And he said, "Well, when you have finished the movie, you invite me and my wife and give us 2 complimentary tickets." About 7 years later, I finished it, took it to Fiji, and I invited him and his wife to come and see the premiere in Fiji. But that's just an example of how all along the way I felt that there were signs that I was meant to make this film. But other than that, it was just pure passion, pure, I don't know, stupidity that made us make that. I think you have to be a little crazy to make an independent film. Yeah.
There's that line in the movie Field of Dreams, "If you build it, he will come." Yeah. And we've made a couple movies that way, where we started the movie thinking that we were going to get investors. Otherwise, we're going to have to pay it for ourselves, and we didn't necessarily have the money to do it. And since I've been there, I can tell you, sometimes he doesn't come.
Question in the back there, in the orange shirt.
Did you, has this movie been shown in a place like Vietnam?
I don't think it's played in Vietnam. We premiered it in the Philippines, in most of the major cities. I think we had the week between Avatar and a Harry Potter movie, so we had like a 1-week window to get into some of their better cinemas, and it was, you know, a really interesting reaction. The press reaction was not so much movie criticism, but, well, let's hear more about this history. And so I hope one of the legacies that it leaves is inspiring Filipino filmmakers, of which there are many very good ones, and a lot of young people who are really starting to, you know, find ways to get things made by hook or crook, to get interested in this period, because there's so many stories from this period, and it's such an important part of Filipino history, and why Filipinos are who they are. But no, it hasn't played in Vietnam. An interesting thing happened in New York. We opened the movie in a commercial theater in New York City, and when you do these kind of things and you do Q&As, usually the person who's the host says, you know, "Don't call on the lady with the big purple hat." you know, because there's somebody in the audience, and I called the wrong guy, and he got up and he'd made a documentary and just really started saying terrible things about the movie. He was an Anglo guy, and his problem was that it wasn't anti-American enough. And all of a sudden, my 20-minute Q&A period, I didn't have to say a single other thing because the audience started having an argument with him, and they were all Puerto Rican people. And they said, this is our history, shut up, you know, and, you know, this is what we want a movie like this about our island. So where it gets out, I think, you know, people find, whether they're familiar with this history or if it's their history at all, they can find things in it that speak to their own situation. The other interesting thing that happened is, as we took it around the Philippines, the most troubled reaction we got were in the areas where there used to be U.S. Army bases. And they were often Catholic academies. And what you could tell is young men would come very troubled and say, you mean the United States was not the hero? You know, and they're thinking World War II. You got the feeling that most of their family were in the American military, and this seemed not only anti-American, but anti-military to them. And they had so little of their own history. It's been taught so little there. It's been you know, when the United States took over the country, we took over the education, did some wonderful things, made it much more democratic. Only rich kids got, you know, educated before the Americans came there. But the people who came, who were known as the Thomasites, because they came on a boat called the Santo Tomas, they told the official story. And the official story is, and this is what Joel Torre, who's, you know, 50-something, who grew up in, you know, with a good Catholic education, was told, the Spanish occupied us and colonized us for 300 years. Then they sold us to the Americans for $20 million. No war, no resistance, no 15 to 20 years of killing, you know. And so, yeah, as it goes around, I'm always interested in what the reaction is, because there's that reaction of people who, well, I should have known this. There's that reaction of, I don't want to know this, you know, and then there's that reaction of, you know, this has nothing to do with me except on a human level.
We have time for one last question. Marcia?
You said several times that this film is really telling your story. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your decision to make it a young woman, a young girl, instead of a male. So the implications of it.
Yes, well, thank you. When I first started writing the screenplay, it was a young boy, about the same age, and I was drawing very heavily from my own experiences. And then one day I got writer's block, and I felt that I had mined all those, you know, experiences that I had. And I was telling my wife, Jeanette, and she said, well, why don't you change the gender and make the boy a girl? And at first I thought, a girl? How can I think like a girl? You know, I don't know what it's like to be, you know, a girl at that age. But then I said to myself, well, I'm supposed to be a fiction writer, you know. I should, you know, try this and see what happens. So I then changed the gender to be a girl. And once I did that, a number of things started falling into place, because as a young girl, it seemed like it was easier for her to identify with the warrior woman, you know, the first ancestress of the island that begins the story. And also the ritual clown at weddings, who is always a woman who overturns the political hierarchy and retells the story of the first woman. So I ended up with this sort of 3 generations of very powerful women, and I think that was very good for the story. But then I started to think, okay, if she's about 13, 14, she's hitting puberty, she's becoming aware of sweet fragrances, the flowers, maybe she's going to have her first period, which is where the blood comes from that she paints on her cheek. So I was beginning to enjoy feeling and thinking like a girl for a while. It's wonderful. You know, we should all try it sometimes and change genders and see what it's like. But, you know, in terms of the fiction writing, because if you are not prepared to to do that, then you are very much, stuck in your own narrow world. And I think one of the things that is good about that is it allows me to empathize more, even if it was just in my mind thinking what it must have been like. Also, in Rotuman culture, we are supposed to take turns. So if you are the youngest, I'm the youngest of 11 children, right? So those above me, older than me, are supposed to have the first opportunity, for example, to go to Fiji. So her older sister is her niece is supposed to be the first to go to Fiji, and that's what all that sibling rivalry was about. And she's boasting, I came first in my class, I'll go to Fiji. She was rubbing, salt into the wound, so to speak. And making her a girl meant that the obstacles are much more difficult for her because boys are privileged over, girls. And the oldest of the three is, the son, but he wasn't, very bright in school. But anyway, the point is that by changing genders, the obstacles for Vicky were much greater than it would have been if she were a boy. And so I think in terms of the story and there being the 3 generations and the obstacles that she had to overcome, it was much better for the story. The other interesting thing is, though we shot this film before Whale Rider, some of you probably have seen Whale Rider. Hands up if you've seen it. Wow, see? Whale Rider is perhaps one of the best known feature films made from Oceania, set in Oceania. And it's about a girl about the same age. Now, it had just happened that when our film was languishing in the can, Whale Rider came out. And when it came out, my first thought was, oh my God, what will people think? They'll think we copied this story from Whale Rider, whereas we had shot it first. But anyway, in some ways it worked in our favor because we were able to ride on the crest of that successful wave of Whale Rider a little bit. And so I think, that was how it happened. So Jeanette Hereniko is to blame for the change of the gender of the protagonist, from, a boy based on my childhood to that of a girl. But in terms of the incidents and the events that happened, a large part of that were drawn from my real life experiences. I should mention that I made Noah, the boy, a little, younger than her, because I didn't want to get into the stereotype of a sort of a love relationship developing between the two. But I've always also, if I can make a confession, I am partial to older women because you can learn so much more from them. Thank you.
Our next film is Sunny. It's going to be at 6:15. It's a spectacular and entertaining film. Hopefully you'll come back for that. But for now, what's going to happen is John will do a book signing outside in the lobby. Hopefully the bookseller has shown up. And you'll have a chance to meet both of them. But also, there's a lot of food out there. So hopefully you're hungry. Please eat. If there's leftovers, please take them home. And then see you again at 6:15. Thank you to both of you. Thank you to Vision's Voices, too, for funding this program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.